Hello, I'm Carrie Casey, and welcome to this child development class, Classroom and Behavioral Management. We're going to go through history, the basics of child development briefly, and then we're going to talk about behavioral and classroom management. As we go through this class, I want you to look at things holistically. This particular section, module, we're going to be talking about philosophers and theorists and who can you relate to, who makes sense to you, and who just seems like they don't match up with your thinking and your understanding. It's okay if some of the theorists or philosophers do not match the way that you think of education or early childhood. They don't have to match you. And as you're going through it, I want you to write down what are your takeaways from each of these elements. Before we get too far into it, let me tell you a little bit about us here at Texas Director. I'm Carrie Casey, and the other principal at Texas Director is Kate Woodward Young, and we've been supporting early childhood educators since the early 2000s, actually since the 90s. But in this company, since the early 2000s, we do director training, teacher training, etc. We do in-person classes, online classes like the one that you're taking right now, director coaching, and director credentialing, just so that you know who we are as we get started. Let's go forward into this unit. These are some terms to know as you're going through. Make sure you feel comfortable with them. Early childhood, child development, early childhood education, early care and education, sometimes called educare. So if you are unfamiliar with these definitions of these terms, please try to take them on board because these are the ones that we're going to be using as we move through this course. Okay? So, as we're talking about history, which is this first unit, we need to talk about what are the historical perspectives of children. Now, I will say that this class is somewhat limited and our text is very limited in that it only really talks about the Western or European and American thought processes around children and child rearing. We don't talk a whole lot about how children are reared in other cultures. Be aware that a lot of these things do not hold fast from region to region or culture to culture. But let's go through what we have from the textbook. For most of Western history, children were just thought of as little adults. They were second-class citizens. They didn't have as much earning power. They didn't have as much brain power. They were easily distractible. They should be seen and not heard because they did not know as much as their elders. And they needed to just do what was told to them by those who had more experience and more knowledge. In the Renaissance and then later in the Enlightenment, this started to shift and children were seen as an ideal or a total good. Okay. So this happened as the same time that the United States was being formed. And by the time of the Revolutionary War, you had the early parts of childhood being protected, and they weren't necessarily expected to work full time before they were 12. They might still be working, but not full time. So that sort of sets the stage. Again, remember that this is not the same in many Eastern cultures or African cultures or native, indigenous people here in the United States or in South America. This is just Western thought processes. So as you were reading through the text, we talked about various different philosophers who weren't specifically thinking about early childhood education. We were talking about John Locke and Rousseau and Cormianus. I always have a hard time with his name. Martin Luther. Each of these philosophers brought a little something that changed the Western thought about early childhood education. What we want you to do is think about them. If you need more information than what's available in the text, please feel free, Wikipedia or other sources, to get more information about their thoughts about early childhood education, or about childhood in general. But the concept that maybe it might be good to have some structure for the children, and that, are they a tabula rasa? Are they a blank slate? Or do they come equipped with their own basic innate knowledge? These are things that these philosophers were looking at. And the importance of education. Martin Luther was very concerned that people be able to read on their own, because he thought it was important that people did individual investigation of the truth, for instance. Is that something you think is important? It's up to you. Then, when we were looking at the educational influencers, we have Dr. Maria Montessori, we have Steiner, we have so many people who were specifically looking at early childhood. Some of those are going to have been much more important to you than others. I'm a huge fan of Dr. Maria Montessori. I think she was amazing. I also really love the Reggio Emilia approach. So Luis was another person that I find very interesting to read where Luis was coming from. Again, it is your job to figure out which ones are going to impact you, which ones are going to resonate with you. We could continue with 20 more people. We could talk about Magda Gerber. We could talk about Bev Boss. There are hundreds and hundreds of people who have been influential in changing our thoughts about early childhood education and about early learning. In the times before the Revolutionary War, we needed so many hands to get everything done. And as the Industrial Revolution came, there was this need for childcare outside the home because the women were not doing the work that they did at home as much. They were working in factories or working at hospitals or hotels or in service. And so there needed to be somewhere else for the children to go, because if you were working in service at a house or a hotel, you could not bring your children with you the way you could if you were gardening for your own food at your own house. And at first, a lot of this was in-home care. And then, of course, we had somebody go, we need to put these children into a separate building, into a school of some sort. And then we get Franz Frobel. He's up here talking about the need to have specific toys designed for children to support their learning, that would focus their learning in directions that he thought were particularly interesting. Franz Frobel was an architect, so he was very concerned with the children having a good understanding of how geometry worked and how their eyes worked. Those were things he made a point to put into his early toys that were specifically designed with an educational purpose. And so we start to get early childhood teachers, right? Whether you are an early childhood teacher or you are a leader in an early childhood program, and so you're supporting early childhood teachers, it's important to know where all of this comes from. in the early 1900s, the first early childhood teachers were really to help support the education of the poor so that the children were not just left strapped in a cradle all day. It was to address inequity. Eventually, it also became something that the elite wanted as well, not just for those who were lower income. So it starts out in one way and it progresses because, again, in those early years, the wealthy could still have a person staying home in the house to provide childcare, whether it was the mother or whether it was someone that they hired and brought in. The first time we get formal government-sponsored childcare in the United States throughout the country was in World War II. It started in California and expanded to other parts of the country. And then it went away after World War II. So all of this comes back to who was guiding our educational philosophies. Then we get into some of these interdisciplinary influences. Sigmund Freud, we all have heard about many, many times. Some of what he posited turned out to be true, and some of it has been disproven since. The same can be said for all three of these men, actually. Some of the concepts that they proposed or observations they met have since been disproved as we have learned more going forward. Benjamin Spock was a huge believer in time out, and we have now moved on to other concepts such as helping a child to take a break. So it's not external guidance as to how long they step away from play, but it's instead internally motivated. Things like that have changed over the course of time. Then we have the slightly more contemporary influences of David Elkin, T. Berry Brazelton, Alfie Kohn, Dr. Bruce Perry, and Daniel Siegel. And again, we could add, and I think we should add, Dr. Bev Boss to this list because she also had a huge impact on early childhood education. She's not specifically mentioned in the textbook, but we will definitely have, I'll go ahead and add an article about Bev Boss to the supplementary materials for this class or for this module. The other thing I want to make sure that you circle back to and you remember, because it was the beginning of public policy in the modern age supporting early childhood education, which was the Perry Preschool Project. It was a longitudinal study. There is still some work being done, even at this point, about the Perry Preschool Project. We have the high scope curriculum because of this study. There are flaws with the Perry Preschool study, more flaws with how people perceive it than with how it was actually done, because the participants were a very specific group and they had a lot of outside support. It was not just based on what happened in the classroom. It was also based on the community support. I want to make sure to circle back on a couple of other things. One of the largest, so the two largest payers for childcare in the United States are both the federal government. The first one is the Department of Defense, because childcare at and around military institutions in the United States and abroad is funded by the United States government, and there are specific rules and regulations to having high quality childcare in the Department of Defense. And then the number two largest um, spender in early childhood is actually the Head Start program. The Head Start program was created and was created by President Lyndon Baines Johnson, and the first program was actually here in Texas. You can go see that facility if you would like. It's down near Johnson City. And the Head Start program has had its pluses and minuses, but without a doubt, it has moved early childhood education forward in a way that it absolutely could not have been done without that. There was an effort to have large federally funded childcare multiple times. One of those was vetoed by President Richard Nixon, and then all of the subsequent ones have not made it out of the federal legislature. So it is an ongoing issue, and we'll see what happens. Maybe we'll have federally funded childcare on a large scale, as do many other developed countries. I'm sure we could talk for another 20 minutes about the history of early childhood education, but the goal of this is simply to give you a foundation and a place to start and figure out who your favorites are. If you were having trading cards, who would you want in your trading cards? And help you have the basis for early childhood education. As we finish up here, you're going to look below. There will be those extra resources, including the article about Bev Boss and a quiz. You can take the quiz twice. If you do not get a score the first time that you want, you can take the quiz again, and then you'll go on to our next unit. See you there.